Hello, today we're going to have a look at the PMDG Boeing 737-700 in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and we're going to follow a functional start procedure to get the aircraft from cold and dark into an operational state. This is not going to follow the real world procedures that a pilot might follow. It's going to miss out a lot of the checks and balances that happen to do with safety. So we are purely going to look at the functions required to get the aircraft ready based on all of the switch positions that are in the aircraft from a cold and dark state, from the default cold and dark state that PMDG have given us. And I'll show you where you can select that before we get started. So the first thing we're going to need to do is make sure that our controllers are going to work correctly in the simulator. So we press the escape key on the keyboard and we go into control options, and we make sure, if we've got multiple profiles configured, that we've got the appropriate profile configured for our controller. Okay, otherwise you may have different mappings for levers or switches or axes. So we're going back into the aircraft once we've confirmed that. The first thing we're going to do with the 737 is provide power to the aircraft. So we go Control 6 takes us to the overhead panel, and the battery switch is in the middle, and we turn the battery on. Okay. The next thing we're going to go and do is go straight down to the FMC. So we press Control and 3, which takes us to the FMC. We are going to connect ground power immediately, but before we do that, we're going to have a quick look in the PMDG setup page. So this gives you the option to load a panel state. So if the aircraft's already running but you want it to become cold and dark while you are sitting in it, go to Panel State Load. And then you can see cold and dark is at the bottom of the first page. There are 3 pages of these options, and next page and previous page will step through them. So if I select cold and dark, I will get the cold and dark state, and this will go out again, and I'll have to go back to the batteries. To make the aircraft start in cold and dark, there's a startup state option, and you can select the one you want. Yeah? And then the next time you load the aircraft, it will be in that state. So I've selected cold and dark. So this procedure relates to the out-of-the-box cold and dark state. Okay, so we're back at the main menu of the FMC now. So we are going to go and connect the ground power to the aircraft. So we need to go to FS Actions, then Ground Services, and Ground Power, and we have to request it. And it will say connecting, and when it has connected, it will say release. In other words, to disconnect it. So if we look outside, we've now got the ground power cart is connected to the aircraft. If we go back inside, we can see it's just saying connected, and it's switched to release. So it's now connected. Okay, so back overhead, Control and 6 to get to the overhead panel. And we can turn the ground power to on. So the switch for ground power is right in the middle here. You switch it to on, and the aircraft switches over to using the ground power. If we are operating in the dark, we can now turn on, if we press Control and 7 to go further overhead, we could turn on the dome light at this point because we have power to the aircraft. The main worry if you're just running on battery is that you are discharging the battery the whole time. So the more things you switch on, the more you're going to discharge the batteries. So you go for the minimal amount of things. Okay, the next thing we're going to do while we're further overhead here is turn on the inertial navigation system. So these 2 knobs here are the inertial navigation system. We turn them both to nav, and we wait for the lights to go to align, and they both have. And now we can move the status knob here over HDG STS. It will read 0. In a few moments it will read the number of minutes until the IRS or inertial navigation system has aligned. So we'll leave that doing what it's doing. We can go back down to the lower part of the overhead panel, which is Control and 6 again. And we can turn the emergency lights to armed. So right in the center here is a flick switch. So this is arming the emergency lights, and we can close the shield on that. We can also close the shield on the battery switch over there. We can turn the window heats to on now. And we can turn the probe heats to on. I am working through a printed checklist that I've prepared that I will make available to download in the notes of the video, so look out for it in the notes. So the next thing we do is go down to the FMC. We are going to prepare a flight plan. So to do that, we go to the menu page to get started, and then we go to FMC, or Flight Management Computer. You can see it's asking us to enter an IRS position, so we can clear out that message and we can go into POS init, and this is where it's asking for the IRS position. So this is a reference position to start the inertial navigation system. So we can go to next page and you'll see the GPS coordinates from the GPS systems on the aircraft for left and right. We can pick one of those. If we just click on the soft key next to it, it transfers the value into the scratch pad. We can type into the scratch pad. So you can see as I press buttons, the letters appear. We can also remove the letters we have typed with the clear button. So we clicked on a value, it put it in the scratch pad. We can then go to the previous page and we just select the soft key next to the field we want to fill in with whatever is in the scratch pad. See, and that makes that go away. We now need to fill reference airport. We don't actually need to, but it will help out the flight management computer. If you see a field with hyphens, it's an optional value. If you see a field with boxes, as we saw with the POS init, then it's a mandatory field. So reference airport, we are at Stansted. The ICAO code for Stansted is EGSS, Echo Golf Sierra Sierra. So we're going to fill that in, and from the system it knows where that airfield is. Okay, then we want to fill in a route. So this is where we are flying from and to. So origin is Stansted, EGSS. And you click on origin and it fills it in. Say we are going to fly to Edinburgh today. We'll put in the ICAO code for Edinburgh Airport, which would be EGPH. We fill that into the destination. We can put the runway we are leaving Stansted on, and this will help the FMC, or flight management computer, with some calculations later. So we'll say runway 22 we are going to leave Stansted on. In the real world you'll be looking at your flight plan, or you'll be referring to your operational flight plan, and you know that would have all the details on it. You would be looking at the winds, and you would take instruction from ATC. So runway 22. Now we're going to set up our departure and arrival from Stansted and into Edinburgh. So we click on the DEP R button, and that lists the airfields with DEP and R next to each of them. So for Stansted EGSS we're going to click on the DEP option, and this shows you our departure options. So we've got runways on the right and standard instrument departures on the left. So we can see 22 is already selected because we've already keyed it in. But we need to choose we don't have to choose a standard instrument departure, we can choose a departure. So you look at your flight plan, and if it names a specific departure, it's worth saying departures are just sequences of waypoints, predetermined sequences of waypoints. So we're going to choose one here, the BKY2S departure. And we'll go back to route, and then we'll go and put the arrival in at Edinburgh. So we'll go in runway number 6 and the AGP E1E standard approach route. So again, standard approach routes are predetermined sequences of waypoints. You've got some transitions here. So quite often a star or a SID will have variations. So they're called transitions, which link them up to airways. So we're going to choose one of those just to show you what happens. And then we go to route, activate, and then execute, and that has essentially created our route. Okay, the next thing we do is go to performance initialization, and we can get to that also. If we happen to look at something else to get back to performance initialization, you can click on the init ref button and it will take you straight here. So the first thing you want to do is fill in the zero fuel weight. This, I'm predicating all of this actually by us having filled the fuel in already. If you want to go and fill the fuel in, you go back to the menu button, go to the FS actions, and there's fuel and payload. So you may want to put a number of passengers on an amount of fuel in. So if I go to fuel, for example, I can fill the plane completely up, or I can set a specific level in pounds or percent. So if I set full, we've got 100% and 46,000 pounds of fuel. Okay, so then we come back to init ref. Remember, we could jump straight back that way. and we can put in our 0 fuel weight, so that's the weight of the airframe. So if we click on it, it will work it out for us, 118. Then if we want to fill in our reserves, notice it's calculated therefore the gross weight because it knows how much fuel we've got on board. So reserves is how much we want to have left over when we land, as a, just a reserve in case we have to go into a hold or whatever else. So we'll put in 2, so £2,000 we want to keep back. Cost index, this relates to a formula that's used for economy, and it really regulates how aggressively the aircraft can accelerate and climb. So a normal number you might see is about 20. It can go as high as 50 on normal flights. The number you can enter can go as high as several hundred, but 20 is a normal number you might typically see. We have to fill in a flight level, so this is the altitude we are going to fly at on our route. So travelling from Stansted to Edinburgh, Edinburgh is slightly to the west of Stansted, so generally the flight level you might fly at would be an even number if you're travelling west. And a flight level is an altitude in feet times 100. So if I wanted to fly at 32,000 feet, it would be flight level 320. You can key in either the feet or the flight level and it will understand. I'll illustrate that here. So if I put in 32000, it will automatically convert it to flight level 320. So it's divided by 100 basically. Okay, next thing we can do is we can execute those changes we've done so far. You can execute at any point. Everything you do is not confirmed until you click execute, and then it becomes the active plan. So we can go to the N1 limit page. We'll leave this alone. This details how you want the aircraft to climb basically. Then we can go to the takeoff page and we can put in our takeoff flaps. So we'll go for 5 degrees of flaps for takeoff, and you can see here it's calculated some numbers for the V speeds and the rotate speed. So based on the runway length and the configuration and weight of the aircraft, it knows now how fast we need to be at the point we rotate on the runway. So to transfer those across to the ones that will be called out during the takeoff run, we just click the buttons next to them and it copies them across. The other thing it can calculate for us is the centre of gravity of the aircraft. So if we click on this button, you can see it's put 20.2 in, and that's given us a trim number. So what that relates to is the elevator trim. So the elevator trim wheel is here, and if we look, it was 6.71. So we need to rotate elevator trim until this small needle gets to 6.71. So we'll let this spin, and the reason for doing this is so when you accelerate along the runway, when you're getting to kind of rotate speeds, so the aircraft will be in equilibrium based on its weight and where the payload is. So the nose won't suddenly lift in an unexpected manner. Okay, so there's our 6.7-ish. It's not an exact science, so don't worry too much about obsessing over it. Okay, so that's basically done. The last thing we need to look at in the flight plan, apart from, I'm not covering filling in the winds or anything like that today. That would be on a much longer workup of a flight plan. What we are going to do though is go and look at the legs, and you can see we've got some discontinuities have appeared. Okay, so we've got our departure. Did we actually choose a departure? Let's go and choose that again. Yes, we didn't choose a departure. So BKY2S, and we had runway 22 already, didn't we? Route. Have we got a bug in the system? Runway 22, BKY2S. It doesn't like it, does it? Departure. Let's go for 5R. There we go, that works. And execute. So then if we go and look in the legs page, this makes a lot more sense. Yeah, we hadn't programmed the correct SID earlier. So this is what happens when you program things at random. Okay, so we've got the standard instrument departure waypoints here, and you can see there are 5 pages of legs now just to cover our departure and approach. So if we say next page, you can see there's a discontinuity has appeared in the middle of the flight plan. So that basically means at the end of the standard instrument departure and before the beginning of the approach route into Edinburgh, there's a gap in the flight plan, and the FMC or flight management computer is not going to work it out for us. Okay, so we can actually disregard that it's not going to work it out and say, okay, we just want to close the gap. So what we could do is say, select this waypoint and pull the flight plan up over the gap. Yeah, which does that. And you can execute that. You can see there's another one here. If we go next page, so there's the end of the flight plan, but there's another discontinuity, so there's a gap. So what we can do is select that one and pull it up over the discontinuity and execute it, and it's done. Okay, so that's the flight plan. I have got another video going through the flight management computer in a lot more detail, but that's the basics of getting our flight plan into the flight management computer. Okay, so now we go to the master control panel. So this is the master control panel for the autopilot of the aircraft, and we turn the flight director switches on. So an autopilot basically has two systems. There's the flight director, which is the computer that figures out what the aircraft needs to do to follow the flight plan. And then there's the autopilot that blindly follows what the flight director tells it to do. Okay, so the flight director does the clever bit. The autopilot just blindly follows its instructions. Okay, so what might we want to set here? We will set an indicated airspeed that we want to climb out at. So we'll say 200 knots just for this example. We're not going to do anything else with that yet. We're also going to set the altitude we're expecting to climb out to today on our initial climb off the runway. So that might be, you would look at your standard instrument departure and find out what the first altitude is that you're climbing to. We might also say, well actually we're taking off runway 22, which is 222 degrees, funnily enough. And we might say we'll use heading select for initially, when we initially turn on the autopilot, we'll just get it to fly that heading. We might also say, because we have a flight plan here, go straight to LNAV mode. Yeah, so that's lateral navigation. That means the aircraft is going to steer along the flight plan we have programmed in. It's going to steer for us. If you notice when we were filling the flight plan in, on the right hand side of those legs there are speeds and altitudes. If you switch on VNAV mode, then the indicated airspeed won't be used on the auto throttle settings. So when we arm the auto throttle, VNAV will take over controlling the throttle according to the speeds and the altitudes here. So the aircraft will disregard our altitude target and use the flight plan for the target altitudes. If we disregard VNAV, then it will use our target altitude. It's worth pointing out, if you are using VNAV and you're flying to the altitudes that are programmed in, but you get an instruction to change your altitude, that's what these two buttons are for. So you've got a speed intervention and an altitude intervention. So if you're on VNAV, for example, and you suddenly need to speed up because you've been given instructions for sequencing or something by ATC, you can just press speed intervention, and regardless of the VNAV following this will all zero out, and you can then use the speed you need to. Okay, so that's all we need to play with here for the moment. We're just making you aware of what's on this master control panel. You've got approach mode, you've got VOR lock mode. We're not going to get into those today. You've got vertical speed mode, so you could pre-program that and say, actually, when we leave the runway, we would like to climb out at 2,500 feet a minute. That would be a sort of a normal steady climb rate. So we'd use LNAV with vertical speed normally. Another way to do it is level change. That means the aircraft will use the N1 speed limit to get to the target altitude. So it's going to climb at the highest rate it can on the maximum N1, which is the percentage of percentage of turbofan speed that you have set in the FMC. Remember, in the initialization pages, there was the N1 limit page, which is where you set what percentages it can use. Okay, so I think that covers the MCP. But typically all you're really worrying about here is presetting things so when you enable the autopilot, the aircraft isn't going to lurch in a different direction. So you're going to get it ready so you have a smooth application of the autopilot. Okay, so we've looked at the MCP now. Just checking my printed list. The other thing we need to do is make sure that we have calibrated the altitude. So there's the barometric pressure over here, which is in either inches or hectopascals. There's a shortcut in the flight simulator. You can press B and you can see the altitude moved slightly. So what we've done is tuned in, we've twisted that knob automatically by pressing B to the local barometric pressure. Okay, so we're ready to carry on with the startup. So Control 6 takes us to the yaw dampers. So we turn the yaw dampers on. We set the cabin pressure to cruise altitude. So this system here sets the barometric pressure, essentially the air pressure in the cabin, and the heating of the cabin. So this whole system is for the cabin environment. So we're going to go to, did we say 32,000 feet? We turn the aft fuel pump number 1 to on. The reason for doing this is we need to provide fuel to the auxiliary power unit, which we are about to start. So the auxiliary power unit is here. The auxiliary power unit is a small jet engine in the rear of the aircraft. So we move it to start and let go. It's a small jet engine in the rear of the aircraft that generates electricity and compressed air, and obviously heat as well. In a full workup you would use it to warm the cabin up before you start the jet engines, but we're doing kind of this short, efficient way of doing it. So you can see the exhaust gas temperature needle here of the APU is raising. It will come up to about 7 and then fall back to about 4. When it falls back, this center light on the bus transfer will light up, and this will allow us to transfer electricity generation to the auxiliary power unit, and at that point we can remove the ground power. So the needle is falling and you'll see this light come on any moment, meaning that it's available to be used. So that the small jet engine is now generating electricity. So we can cross feed over to it. And at this point the ground power is actually disconnected. So we can go back below and we can go back to the menu page, back to FS Actions, back to ground services, and we can release the ground power now because it's not being used. Okay, the switch up here for ground power doesn't actually do anything. Once you've transferred over, it's effectively switched it off for us. Okay, at this point we're getting ready to start the engines. That's the reason we've switched the APU on. So we need to go and turn the APU bleed on. We need to go and turn the anti-collision lights on. So we're warning people outside. The APU bleed provides the compressed air from the APU to the jet engines to spin them up. Okay, another thing we need to do at this point, again, the exact order you do these things in is debatable, and different operators will have slightly different orders. We're going to remove the wheel chocks. But before we do so, we need to look around in the cockpit, and I can't from this viewpoint. I'm going to go back to the pilot's view. We're going to make sure the parking brake is on, and we are going to remove the wheel chocks. Okay, which is in that FS Options page. So back up overhead. We have transferred power, we have switched the APU bleed on, we've turned the anti-collision lights on, we've disconnected the ground power, we've removed the chocks. So at this point we switch all the fuel pumps on, we're getting ready to start the engines. So this is where you would perform your pushback normally. We're not going to bother today, we're in a very fortuitous place we're parked, where we can taxi straight out. So, fuel pumps are on, APU bleed is on, so we can start the engines. So to start the engines, we turn the right hand engine starter switch on the overhead panel here to GRD, and we switch on ignition to the right engine. And if we look down, you will see the speed of N2 is increasing. N2 is the gas turbine on the right side of the aeroplane. So if we look at the engines on a 737, there's actually two parts. The central part is the gas turbine, the jet engine, and the outside part with the huge fan is the turbo fan. Okay, and you can see it's spinning up. And it's got to 29 all on its own. That's just the compressed air spinning it. To make it go any faster, we have to switch on the starter switch, which introduces fuel to the engine. Yeah, so you'll suddenly see the exhaust gas temperature has risen, and it's carried on past the number it was at, and it's now accelerating and the engine's up and running. When the engine is up and running, the switch for the starter will go back to off all on its own. So if we wait for that to happen, give it a few seconds. There we go. So now we can start on engine number 1. So we've done that. To GRD, ignition to the left engine, and you can see the numbers coming up. So N2 is coming up. You can flick the starter switch when it gets to about 20, 22, 21, 22, and flick the starter switch and it will carry on straight past all on its own. So you can see the exhaust gas temperature is rising as the fuel comes in. The fuel flow is increasing, and the N1, the turbofan speed, is coming up as well now. So there's a gearbox basically between the gas turbine and the turbofan. So again, the switch will flick to off all on its own. So if we just wait for that to happen. So it's just happened. Now the engines are running, we can actually switch over power generation to the engines. So back on this crossfeed panel, we can flick both switches down to the on position, and you'll notice the APU is now lit up, meaning it's basically off bus. In other words, it's there, it's available, but we're not using it anymore. So for that very reason, we can switch off the APU bleed now, and we can actually switch off the auxiliary power unit. So you'll see the exhaust gas temperature of the APU will slowly drop now. Okay, so the engines are running, the APU is off. Hydraulic pumps to on. So they're over here, hydraulic pumps, make sure they are all on. So the hydraulic pumps provide the hydraulics for the control surfaces. Packs to auto. So that's the cabin pressurization and heating system. So this is going to provide warm air to the cabin, because remember, at altitude the temperature is going to be minus a significant number. So it's freezing at high altitude. So you want heat from the engines to be ducted into the passenger cabin. You also want air pressure in the passenger cabin, because at high altitude the air is much thinner and everybody would not have enough oxygen to breathe. So the engines are also used via the packs to compress air into the cabin. Taxi lights to on. We're getting there. So back in our normal position here, we moved the flaps to our takeoff position. So we said 5 degrees on the FMC, didn't we, for our takeoff, which is a normal number for the 737. And you can see on the little dial here that reflects the flaps are in transit. So it means they're moving. It takes them a while to get there. If you've ever watched the wing of a big jet out of the window, it takes a while for them to rearrange themselves. So there we go, flaps are now at 5 degrees. Next thing we do, and again this usually happens during taxi. Remember, we didn't bother with a pushback. So what we can do, we'll start taxiing towards the runway. So we remove the parking brake and we will ease the throttle forwards, and we should start rolling, and we can see the ground is rolling. So we're going to turn right immediately. Run over the guy with the trolley. So now we're going out towards the runway. We could go and turn the strobe lights on. So if you remember, looking overhead, there's this strobe light. We had it on steady earlier on. We now put it onto strobing, so it's flashing. You don't do this when you're too near the terminals. Normally you would do it only when you get to the runway. So we're doing it a little bit early because it could blind people. It's a very, very bright light. Okay, so we're going to taxi out to the runway. At this point you would review the master control panel again to confirm how you're going to leave the airfield. So for our purposes today we will go for vertical speed mode, and we'll reprogram it to climb out at say 2,500 feet a minute. We're going to use LNAV. Just keep an eye on where we're going. We're going to switch on the auto throttle as well, but we'll do that as we come off the ground. There are many ways to fly a Boeing 737. There are many ways to use these various controls. There is no one correct way, and different situations would demand different ways of using it. So there is a toga option on the throttle. There's a small button which goes straight for takeoff go around power setting. We are not going to use it today. We're just going to use the throttle because I want to illustrate something to you as we roll down the runway. So you can see on the EFIS display here we've got a view in map view that reflects our flight plan, and that can be controlled up here. Again, another video for another day to go into detail about that. Okay, so we're on the runway. So we get straightened up and we go increase power, and this is the reason I didn't want to show you toga straight away. I'm going to push the throttles all the way to their stops. Look at the percentages. If you hold the throttles on against their stops and leave them there, you will destroy the engines. You can run them above 100%. So I'm pulling them back gently. And we're waiting for the V speeds.
V1 rotate.
There we go. So we rotate to a 15-degree climb out typically. Okay, so gear up. We wait for 3 greens and then we can move the gear back to the center position. But on the way we can now go for autopilot and auto throttle. And we can go for speed mode on the throttle. So this is the very manual way of doing things. Okay, so now we have got the lights have gone out on the undercarriage. We can move that back to off. Otherwise, the up position is basically charging the hydraulics the entire time. And that's it. We're on our way. The auto throttle is taking care of airspeed. We are climbing towards our target altitude at a vertical speed we have set. So from this point on, we are managing climb out and cruise. So that is our flight done. Also, not our flight done, but the beginning of the flight. Okay, so I did some things differently than you normally would on purpose to show you facets of the aircraft. But that's the basics. That gets you into the air, and we described quite a lot along the way quite quickly. And we missed a lot out about safety checks. So as I said at the start, this is an entirely functional startup sequence. Yeah, to get you through starting the plane up and to explain what does what and what relies on what. Okay, so a few things to point out. If you have discontinuities in your flight plan, you won't be able to select LNAV. So you have to complete your flight plan before LNAV can be used. Otherwise, there's not really much more to say today. We've really covered everything I wanted to. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. And we'll see you again very soon.